Thank you, my lady. Mr. Burnham, welcome back. Before we continue evidence, can I invite you just to slow down a little bit, because there's a record being kept of what you're saying, and also answers. If we could try and make them a little bit shorter, I think paradoxically we will cover more, if that's all right. Let's see how we get on. In terms of the timeline, we were just coming up to the first lockdown in March 2020. And I just wanted to deal with the initial contact with central government in the lead up to the first lockdown. And you touch upon this in your evidence. There was 3 meetings. The first on the 11th of March, which I'll summarise. You met Baroness Veer, who was a junior minister in the Department of Transport at that time, and that was in relation to funding as the public transport. The second meeting was on the 12th of March, and this is one of more relevance, perhaps, was meeting with Robert Jenrick, who was the then Secretary of State for the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government, MHCLG, as it was then known as, now the Department of Living Up. And in relation to that meeting on the 12th of March, can you assist us? What did that relate to?
That meeting was to inform us about the commencement of the delay phase. And in effect, I think it was the introduction of the shielding arrangements. But there were also some strange announcements about people not taking cruises or school holidays not happening. It was not an announcement that was in the sort of, getting close to the heart, the enormity of what lay ahead a few days later. I think we talked about PPE, how were we getting on with local arrangements. It was quite a relaxed meeting, if I remember rightly.
But an opportunity for you to speak with the Secretary of State for MHCLG, which was the liaison department between central government and local government.
Yes, and if I remember, I think we were beginning to say to him, we're becoming more worried, it feels like it's changing, and it was a good opportunity. And although relations would get more difficult later in the year, at that point, the fact that he was convening the mayors to have that type of discussion was a good thing.
The last meeting before lockdown, in fact, was on the 23rd of March, which was the day lockdown was formally announced by the then Prime Minister. And you had a meeting that evening at 6:30 with the Secretary of State for Transport, who was Grant Shapps at that time. And that was with other Metro mayors, and that was in relation to transport as well. Was there any indication at that stage that lockdown was about to be announced?
I see, from my memory of that period, it wasn't so much what was happening in those meetings, it was what was happening outside of them. From the meeting with Robert Jenrick up until the 23rd of March, I can remember things becoming increasingly fraught, to the point where on the Monday of the 23rd of March, I think I appeared on Good Morning Britain and called for lockdown, a national lockdown. And I remember debating with my team, it felt strange to say it when the government weren't saying it at that time. And we decided it was right to say it because of what was coming through our directors of public health. So it felt like the whole world was kind of saying this, we can't carry on like this. And yet, from memory, I think Grant Shapps possibly alluded to there might be an announcement coming later. You can probably guess what it is, type approach in that meeting. But no, we were not sat down and briefed on the implications of a national lockdown.
And it's a matter of a record. 2 hours later, the Prime Minister made the national announcement on national television. Another feature in terms of communication and coordination, which is the focus of these questions, relates to Cobra and whether you were invited to attend any Cobra meetings. You've heard questions being asked of Mr. Khan in relation to that. So in the lead up to lockdown number 1, were you invited to any Cobra meetings?
No.
Did you ask to attend any Cobra meetings?
Repeatedly.
In what way? Was this via officials, back channels, requests with Secretary of States?
I referred to a thread that I put out on Twitter in the session before lunch. Pretty sure that I said there that the mayors should be invited to, if not all, but certainly some Cobra meetings. And the reason I said that was because I chaired it during swine flu. And it was a very open environment. It wasn't a small number of people just meeting in total secrecy and, keeping it all to themselves, using the facilities of the Cabinet Office, we would often have a meeting with ministers in the room, but then people able to dial in from around the country.
So in your view, there was a way in which Metro mayors could have been participants in Cobra, which was practical?
Certainly. I mean, it should have happened. I have a memory of chairing a weekly meeting during swine flu where in the Cabinet Office, with all of the technology, you could bring in voices from around the country. And I remember a council leader here or a official in the Welsh or the Scottish government would intervene in those meetings. It was, I would say, the way it should have been done.
Just in relation to that, we've heard other evidence regarding the actual utility of the Cobra meetings, whether there were much benefit to them. But at that time, from your perspective, what benefit did you think it would have been as an attendee at a Cobra meeting?
A structured environment where serious issues could have been properly raised. For instance, one that myself and the Mayor of the Liverpool City region raised right through the whole thing and never got a response, which was financial support for people on the lowest incomes, insecure work, to self-isolate if asked to do so, so people who had no access to sick pay. We repeatedly raised that issue.
We'll come back to that as a topic,
sure,
if I
may. But also people excluded from public support, the self-employed, freelancers. We were raising these issues, but in some ways they had nowhere to go. We raised them in the media because we had no alternative. If Cobra had been properly structured, we would have been able to put these issues on the agenda, have proper response to them, but we were never afforded that opportunity.
And in relation to that, you touched upon your colleague, fellow mayor, Metro Mayor, the Mayor of Liverpool, and both of you in May and June 2020 made a number of public announcements seeking that you would have the opportunity to attend Cobra. And in essence, is this a fair summary, that you wish to have the voice of the English regions represented?
100%. Our worry was that there was a London centricity in decision making, and we probably wanted to create the balance in people's thinking by saying, look, this is how it seems from here. And genuinely, it was in the spirit of national emergency. We weren't there to use it as a platform for politics or anything like that. It was simply to say, we are worried. This is a challenging situation. We want to be heard and just, taken as seriously as anywhere else. I mean, a classic example would be the lifting of the first national lockdown.
So before we get to that, Mr. Burnham, if you just forgive me for interrupting, rewinding a couple of stages. You said that you had asked to attend, and then you mentioned a Twitter feed. Did you contact Number 10 and ask to attend Cobra?
Yes. In many ways, Chair, the request was made. Did I write formally? I would have to check. I don't recall ever saying, please invite me to Cobra, but the point was made to ministers in conversations in some of the meetings that have been described. We would often make this point that it would be better if we were invited so we could discuss these things in a structured environment rather than in ad hoc meetings with ministers.
Second question, I have heard from others that Cobra is effective for a shorter term emergency, but not for the longer term emergency. What do you say to that?
Well, there needs to be a central coordinating body that brings together political decision makers in any emergency, whether it's short or long, I would say to that, be it Cobra or a cabinet committee. I did not attend one meeting of Cobra right through the pandemic, and people need to ask whether a city region with 2.8 million people in it should never have the opportunity to say, well, this is how it looks from here. The only UK government body that I attended was the one of the nations, chaired by Michael Gove, when we had an issue with Scotland and a travel ban. That was the only formal central government committee that I was asked to attend.
Which we'll come back to. We're going to stick to a structured approach, following on from your desire to have a structured approach.
Can I come back to national lockdown?
Yes, please. You want to go back to national lockdown? Yes. We're going back to March 2020.
I mean, it's just this is the critical thing. Well, this was May 2020, of course, by that.
This is coming. I am going to move on to that. You're now talking about leaving national lockdown, which I'm going to move on to in a moment. Let's stick to communication, and then we'll move to the next parts in the chronology. You used the words ad hoc in your statement, and indeed a few moments ago, your communications with central government. You also mentioned that there was reasonable official level communications between officials, civil servants.
Yes.
So there was that reasonable communication. There was political communication. We've touched upon some of it, but that was sporadic. Is that correct?
Yes.
And you mentioned this, we don't need to turn to it, paragraph 76, is that in your experience, ministers actively encouraged informal and private communications about significant decisions and often initiate them. And you use an example, several ministers, including the Health Secretary, Matt Hancock. Was this a productive line of communication, WhatsApps, texts with ministers of state and secretaries of state?
It could be, and I often found it helpful that they would reach out in that way, but it wasn't adequate, because actually there needed to be a place where a mayor might raise something and everybody in the system heard it, and there wasn't such a facility. So it was better than nothing, but it wasn't sufficient.
In terms of the impact regarding, we've been talking about communication and coordination between local and central government from your perspective. And you touch upon this in your statement at paragraph 23. And you described approach to the pandemic as overly top-down and overly centralised. There was a lack of adequate consultation and poor communications. It frequently felt chaotic. Is that the view you formed?
Very much so. It was massively centralised. You had a mature system like Greater Manchester that was simply bypassed. And the kind of thing that sticks in my mind from the period we're talking about is genuine astonishment when word came through from officials who were in good contact with civil servants in the departments saying that local testing would be stood down. And to me, that was like, I could not even begin to get my head around why local testing teams in our, what were CCGs at the time, would be stood down.
So in relation to that, CCGs, to help everybody else, it stands
Clinical Commissioning Group.
Yes. And this was on the 18th of March 2020 is when you described as a significant key moment that you were informed that the local testing was stood down without consultation. Mm-hmm. And then you expressed a concern that the new location for testing from a central perspective was going to be at Manchester Airport. And that was
so that location was chosen without any consultation with us. So the airport might make sense if you're sitting in an office in Downing Street or in the Cabinet Office, or the airport, well, everyone can get... Well, no, they can't, actually. But there was a huge testing facility that opened that, in the end, people just couldn't get to. If you live in Oldham or Rochdale, you can't easily get to Manchester Airport, but that was not understood, it would seem. But they didn't ask us. No. I mean, fancy opening a testing station in Greater Manchester without consulting us on the location.
Oldham, Bolton, north of the city, airport, south of the city. Mm-hmm. And
correct.
Of course, if one has to travel, costs involved.
Yes.
I want to move on to the Metro Mayors Group and a meeting on the 1st of May 2020, which you and your fellow members of that group had with the Prime Minister. And there's a document which is at INQ 000202, which we have right in front of us. Thank you so much. And we see at paragraph 2 just what the Metro Mayors are. It covers a number of different regional areas, represents over 40% of the population of England, and it's a combined GVA. This is where you're going to be tested as a former Chief Secretary to the Treasury. GVA stands for?
Gross value added.
We probably don't need to go into economics too much, but it really just shows that there is significant economic output from those areas.
Yes.
45% of the overall England GVA, 750 billion. And there's a request there empowering mayors to lead recovery planning for their regions with help put robust plans in place. So this is where we're still in that restrictions. We're looking forward to a period where restrictions may be eased. I want to move on, please, to paragraph 5, if I may. And this document, which was prepared by the Metro Mayors and provided to the Prime Minister, is that correct?
Yes.
And in relation to that, it says recovery will be a national effort. We must work together to ensure alignment and planning and to give confidence to the country and our regions. To coordinate our efforts, we would welcome regular discussions with government. A monthly call between mayors, Prime Minister and Chancellor will help align our efforts. And what was the response at that meeting or thereafter in relation to this request for more regular communication?
Well, it didn't happen. I think we had one meeting with the then Chancellor, now Prime Minister, during the pandemic. One meeting, I think, possibly two with the Prime Minister. But this call did not meet with approval. And the thing I would just say, the M9, for people who don't know, this is a cross-party group of mayors.
We've heard this morning that I think there was at that time 2 Conservative mayors.
Yes.
And the bulk were Labour elected mayors.
In fact, more. There was a Conservative mayor in Cambridgeshire and Peterborough, in the west of England, Tees Valley, and in West Midlands, Andy Street. The thing is, we take seriously our responsibility as mayors to work on a place-first rather than a party-first basis. And that's the strength that we can bring to UK governance, that we can, and we do, and we were prepared. You could see this in what we were saying to the government.
Well, a joint document from mayors from different political fields.
Yes, and in this moment in time, there was still very much a spirit of, we're all here to help. What can we do? Work with us. Yes. But then that changed through the year as we just weren't listened to, and that's how 2020 proceeded. The goodwill, the offers, we're here. How can we help? Work with us, use us.
Just pause there, because we're going to just one more part of this document, and then we'll move on to the deterioration. So paragraph 9, please, which is on page 2, the bottom of page 2. Thank you. So, summary, next steps. We would welcome a statement from government empowering mayors to lead regional recovery plans. And overleaf, please. Discussion with Chancellor on flexibilities and resources, reference to financial fundings, and regular meetings to align planning and agree action. So that was the position on the 1st of May. And then on the 10th of May, there was an announcement regarding the easing of lockdowns. The easing of lockdown, forgive me, as the path moving out of restrictions. And you described that as a really significant occasion in your experience from the perspective of Mayor of Greater Manchester. Why was that?
Similar to the standing down of local testing, I was astonished when word filtered through. It was a Wednesday morning, I think, to our COVID emergency committee that there may be an announcement coming. Someone said at our meeting about stay at home is ending tonight or tomorrow, and it's going to become stay alert. And I was, what? How? Here we had such a high case rate, or here I should say, Greater Manchester, we had a high case rate. And bear in mind that COVID had spread from south to north. It had moved up through the country, through the Midlands.
So there's a lag between London's progress. In other words, Manchester was further behind in the recovery than London.
I think experts would say a 2 to 3 week lag in terms of the way the peaks were experienced. But we were still very much closer to our peak than let's say, the southern half of the country. So
you had that surprise shock as to the announcement. Does it follow that there wasn't any consultation prior?
There was zero consultation, and this is the point about Cobra involving. This is a new infrastructure that we've built in this country of combined authorities and mayors. And in a situation like this, it can add huge value to the national response to a pandemic. It was largely bypassed.
And if you were consulted, what would you have said?
Don't lift it. Because it's too early for Greater Manchester. Because we had a higher case rate than other parts of the country. And it's why I say in my evidence statement, that there was a London centricity in decision making. I think they were looking more at the picture in London, and they were more concerned with that than they were with the picture where we were. There was pressure to lift it from kind of voices here, and I think the decision was more influenced by that than what we were saying. We didn't, if we'd have been asked, we'd have told them that they shouldn't do it. And I think because of that, Greater Manchester was left stuck with a high case rate throughout the rest of 2020.
Which we're going to touch upon in a moment and how that caused real difficulties. Last point regarding the message in May about easing of lockdowns and return to work, which was one aspect as well, which emerged. How was the return to work message received by you and your fellow Metro Mayors group members?
I mean, of course, everybody wanted to support the economy, but it was just more difficult for us. And I recall something from this period that needs to be remembered, which was a lot of people never left work. And in the less well-off parts of the country, people weren't, by and large, sitting in their gardens doing whatever on Zoom. They were in work. And in boroughs in Greater Manchester, a high percentage of people were working in warehousing or in manufacturing or in other things. The worry we had, and again, it was one that I shared with the Mayor of the Liverpool City region, was the workplace guidance wasn't strong enough. The regulation said people should keep a 2-metre distance where possible. And we were inundated, actually, with complaints from distribution centres, warehouses across the northwest, both of us, people saying that their workplace wasn't safe.
If you had more notice or any notice, would that have helped being able to respond to these queries on a local level?
Always the case.
Yes.
If we had been involved earlier in the discussion and we could see how the thinking was building towards regulations or new messages to the public, we would have been at least ready for those messages, and we'd been able to tell our own system how to get ready to implement it. It came mostly to a head for us in July, which we may want to get onto.
We will in a moment, but I want to deal with data, if I can,
Yes.
very briefly. I know it's not the most exciting subjects, but
Well, it was a big one for us in this period.
And an important subject as well. We're going to deal with data, and one of the issues you mentioned in June 2020 was you were struggling to manage the stubbornly high case rate in Manchester. That's what you say in your statement, in paragraph 19. And your lead director of public health was having difficulties in accessing data regarding those who had tested positive. And this was something which was causing real difficulties. In terms of test and trace, that's something which is going to be considered by the inquiry at a later stage. So I want to deal with this quite shortly. But what was the issue in relation to getting data in June 2020 for you?
Well, we couldn't.
Yes.
We asked for patient identifiable data.
And that was refused. Is that the position?
It was refused.
And
it was refused for weeks and weeks and weeks. And I had to enter another media battle to try and get hold of that data. This was data that they really had no argument with us. In the law that they passed in early March, the COVID emergency legislation, COVID-19 was added to the list of notifiable diseases.
So a local authority was under a duty, a local public health authority was under a duty to report COVID-19.
It had to be reported.
Yes.
And yet this new test and trace system that they had outsourced said it didn't have to give us this data, and ministers said they didn't either, and we had to show them the law that they had passed, and this was important to us.
And why was it important in terms of getting that data?
Because lockdown had been lifted too early. We had a high case rate. Many of our residents were in jobs where they didn't get sick pay. They couldn't go home if they were ill because their employment wouldn't support them being paid if they were off ill. So we had fundamentals that were hard to deal with. We wanted the difference between the test and trace system and what we wanted to do for our proposals for more locally run tracing, contact tracing, was the national outsource system was making calls from call centres that nobody was answering. We wanted the data so we could knock on doors. And we said to the government right the way through this period, local contact tracing will be much more effective than the call centre approach. And in the end, I had to get Greater Manchester Fire and Rescue Service to kind of put a team together so we could say to the government, please just give us this data, let us do local contact tracing.
You got the data in due course
After a battle.
Yes, and was that applied? Did you apply that on a local level after obtaining the data? Did you do anything?
Yes, of course.
Yes, okay. I'm going to move on to a different topic. Test and trace is one which we'll return back to. I want to deal with a topic which perhaps you never thought you were going to deal with when you were elected in 2017, is when you found yourself in a dispute with the First Minister from Scotland. I've been invited to address that with you. Is it
It was 2021, just because we're not just in 2020 now.
That's correct. Yeah. Thank you. In 2021, there was it a case? Was it 2021 or was it 2020 when there was an issue between you and the First Minister regarding a ban on the people of Manchester travelling to Scotland, or people from Scotland travelling down to
2021.
21. Thank you. So that's where we are in a time period. And is this a fair summary that there was an announcement by the First Minister that those people from Scottish people weren't allowed to travel to Manchester, and people from Manchester weren't allowed to travel to Scotland?
Well, the first I knew about it was I was on my weekly phone-in on BBC Manchester, and a lady rang in from Bolton, and she said, our walking holiday's been cancelled in the Cairngorms because the guest house says they can't take somebody from a Bolton postcode. So I went back to the office and asked the office to check. And sure enough, we discovered that the Scottish government had to put a ban on Bolton people travelling to Scotland without any notification or information about that. And that was the first I became aware of the issue. Then, if you go forward a few days later, I was actually sitting in my garden the night after England had played Scotland at Wembley in the delayed European Football Championships. And there was a picture of lots of people in the fountain in Trafalgar Square. But underneath that photo was a headline that said, Scottish Government puts travel ban on Salford and Manchester. That's quite a big deal when you're putting a travel ban on. That was the first I'd heard of it, when they actually banned people from Manchester and Salford travelling to Scotland. No notification, no consultation, exactly what the Scottish National Party would always have accused Westminster of doing to Scotland. Well, they had done exactly the same to us.
So pausing there, no consultation in the way you've expressed. Was there any subsequent discussion about how this was going to be enforced? Was there police officers lining the platforms at Manchester Piccadilly?
Well, no, no, there weren't, and it wasn't our policy. We had no understanding of what they were trying to do, and as I understood it, the Scottish government wasn't enforcing it because people from Scotland were coming down and getting off the train at Manchester Piccadilly. It was bizarre, if I'm honest, and as I say, Michael Gove invited me to the Committee of the Nations, and I had an exchange with the former First Minister at that meeting. In the days that followed, we pointed out that the case rate in Scotland had gone higher than in Manchester, Salford and Bolton, and it wasn't long before the travel ban was removed. No. But it was another example of how the lack of UK coordination.
A bizarre footnote to the pandemic, perhaps, and at that meeting with Mr. Gove, I think it was an agreement between you and the First Ministers, a joint ambition towards a more unified approach as far as possible.
Yes.
And let's move on, then, if we may. We're going to move well into summer 2020, so we're now going back a year, but in that summer 2020. And the 30th of July is the next significant date in 2020. That's when the UK government announced local restrictions on household mixing in Greater Manchester from midnight.
Yep.
How much notice and detail did you receive in advance of that announcement?
Minimal. I had a call around about 4 o'clock from the Health Secretary, and he said that we needed to do something because the case rate in Greater Manchester got too high. I said, yes, I can see that it is too high. We are not against doing something, but I can't just announce with you that I got to go through the local council leaders. He asked me if I would do that. This, in effect, would become what's known as Tier 2. So
it wasn't Tier 2 then, but as
no,
you say,
it wasn't
in effect,
called that.
Yes.
It was the first restrictions on household mixing.
Yes.
It was to be ourselves, parts of Lancashire and parts of West Yorkshire,
yes, that
would go under these restrictions in late July. But it was chaotic. You asked me before when you quoted me saying it felt chaotic. This was as chaotic as it gets because they were putting these restrictions on us. He gave me an hour to talk to our local leaders, and to those who claim that we were being obstructive, or we said we were ready to do. We can see the issue. We're ready to work with you. But we did immediately start to make the point that this is going to have an impact on people. It's going to have an impact on people's businesses. What I remember is that about 8 o'clock that night, the health secretary made a very cursory announcement to a TV camera in 4 Millbank that we would be going under these restrictions, and then all hell broke loose. My Twitter feed, which is, I was using it a lot at that time to have direct communication with people in Greater Manchester. It was just absolutely inundated with people saying, I'm a painter and decorator. I work in people's homes. Can I go to work tomorrow? I'm a childminder. Can I go to work tomorrow? I'm a domiciliary care worker. Can I go to work tomorrow?
So the lack of notice.
There wasn't a Q&A.
Yes.
There was not a UK government frequently asked questions that we could point people to. There was nothing. There was nothing put up on the website. If something went up, I think it was gone 11 o'clock that night, probably even later.
Did this also align with the time of Eid? That Eid was, the celebration of Eid was around that time?
It did. And I think there was a concern that there would be, large-scale household mixing, as we saw similarly played out at Christmas.
Yes.
It was the same thing got played out, didn't it?
But in terms of managing a message, doing it at such short notice for such a significant religious festival.
It was as if they hadn't realised it late, and and hence the situation we found ourselves in.
Going to move on slightly to this period of local restrictions, inverted commas, Tier 2 light, perhaps. You've got 12 areas within Greater Manchester. 10, forgive me. Of those 10 areas, was the restrictions uniform to the 10 areas?
Initially, but you can imagine that there was lots of kind of, people were suffering under these restrictions. They weren't light. If you can't mix at home,
yes,
it has a real impact on people.
But there's a variation in Greater Manchester between cases. Some were higher in certain areas, some were lower in certain cases.
That's right. So at the time those restrictions went in, Wigan Borough, where I live, was quite low. And I would be out walking the dog and people say, why on earth are we in these restrictions? But then Wigan's case rate changed while we were in and went higher, and then the places that had higher had gone a bit lower, and then they were complaining. In the end, we used to have this weekly process with the government. It was at their Gold Committee. They would work through this whole process every week, reviewing restrictions, and our 10 boroughs would lobby at the GM COVID Emergency Committee saying, put the case forward for us to be taken out. We want to be... We tried to stick with the Greater Manchester approach for a long time, but in the end it got hard to manage some of the differences, and I think Stockport were taken out at one point and Trafford possibly were taken out at one point.
Going forward, 10 individual areas, boroughs, is it practical having restrictions in Stockport and no restrictions in Bolton or vice versa?
No, it's not.
And why is that? What's the difficulty?
Well, it gets you to whether the tier system works. People are going to travel. Life does not end at a local government administrative boundary. People are going over that boundary every day. People don't live their life within the boundaries of those boroughs. Greater Manchester, it's a system where everyone's crossing those boundaries every day going around their work. As I say, it's something that might make sense in an office somewhere, but it didn't make sense. The reality of it didn't make sense
So
for us.
on the ground, with a desire to make things work in the public interest, we moved through summer 2020 and we're into August, autumn 2020. And on the 8th of September, further restrictions were imposed by the UK government on Bolton. And that was without consultation, and you described that as another key moment. And why was that?
Because, again, from nowhere, all hospitality was closed in the borough of Bolton with no package of support for the businesses affected.
So pausing there, and not wishing to be London-centric, Bury has got a proud history. Would it be described as an area which is economically deprived, or parts of it have got economic deprivation?
Bolton?
Yes.
Yes, you would say it's quite mixed, but there are parts of Bolton that have significant deprivation.
So in relation to the need for financial support, was there any financial support offered when this was announced?
None.
And did you ask
And the
for
former Conservative leader of Bolton, who we worked with really closely during the pandemic, who sadly passed away the following year, he was saying to me, whatever you can do, Andy, I'll work with you. The government should not treat a place like Bolton like this. And the frustration we all felt was, because they'd just done it to Bolton, it was like no one else could see it, no one else in the country was bothered. But the impact there was really huge. And I do, just by an aside, just need to say, there was a strong feeling that Eat Out to Help Out had caused some of the problems that Bolton were experiencing.
Well, let's focusing on Bolton, not Bury, Bolton for a moment. So you had this background where there was restrictions which had now been imposed in Manchester since May.
Yep.
A lack of financial support.
Yes.
No financial support for the people of the businesses of Bolton.
True.
And was this something that you raised at any stage with Matt Hancock, the Secretary of State for Health?
Frequently.
And the response?
To be fair, he was more sympathetic, actually, than some of the other ministers that I spoke to about this matter. We were coming through the summer into the early autumn feeling increasingly frustrated. We'd spent pretty much the best part of a year by now saying, look, what's happening here? Help us. Help us with the contact tracing. Give us that data. Help us, support you to put in place measures rather than this chaotic way. And particularly help our people and our businesses if you're going to ask us to close them. And it felt like we were just shouting into the abyss in this period.
Let's move on to the 5th of October, which is a meeting between the Metro mayors and Mr. Hancock. This is something you touch upon in your statement, and perhaps we could bring that up at paragraph 70 of your statement. You describe how you had that meeting. Cases had risen across the country in September. We're into October, and that's the context. And at paragraph 70A, we wanted to see a clear role for mayors in informing decision-making, communication and engagement. And this since March had been limited. Again, this request for a regular meeting. Response from Matt Hancock in relation to this request for more regularity in contact between the Metro mayors and central government. Can you recall?
I think there was like a broad, oh yes, we must, and it needs to get better. But I'm just looking at the date on this note, 5th of October. It sticks in my mind because 2 days later was my 20th wedding anniversary. And I'd been out in Manchester with my wife, and we were getting a train home. And on the train, I remember we were looking at our phones, tomorrow's front pages, and one of them was pubs to close across northern England. So this was the first of the tier 3 issues coming. And that had not been mentioned to us in this meeting just a couple of days before.
Okay, so in terms of the timeline, your wedding anniversary 2 days after that, and you're going to refer to something which wasn't mentioned at this meeting. Let's turn to 70 paragraph B, please. Thank you, overleaf. And we'll see what else was mentioned at the meeting so everyone can put into context. You talk about the local restrictions, lockdown measures. I say you refer to in your statement. The tier approach being developed was helpful. This is the prospective tier approach. The current position at that time was too complex, and we must take steps to support people to comply. A crucial element of these plans must be to clarify on how and when places move back out of these measures, i.e. between the tiers. So the view at that stage, this is before you've experienced tiers, 1, 2 and 3. The view expressed was that the tier approach would be helpful. Why did you hold that view at that time?
This was an M9 document, if I remember, not a Greater Manchester document.
It's quoted in your. I think you refer to your statement.
Yeah.
And I think there's a dissenting voice from you in that.
Because I was in a different. You've always got to remember, I was in a different position to the other 8 mayors, in that we'd been under restrictions and others hadn't, and I'd grown frustrated about the approach, particularly the lack of support. I think this was trying to articulate the view of everybody, and it did touch then on some of the frustrations everybody had, i.e. there was a feeling that if you go into these measures, you don't come back out again. They stay there, and everyone wanted a de-escalation sort of regime. You know, when do you come out if you've gone in?
So if you pull out of the document again, so a consensus approach, if this is you producing what was presented as a Metro document, but you had your concerns. And we move on to financial support as well, the real need for financial support to paragraph C. That the impact of COVID was obviously not only on health. Lockdown could only work if financial support was in place for those we were asking to close businesses or limit activity.
Well, this was very much informed by the Bolton experience. And I was pleased that Andy Street supported it, as you can see.
Yes, he's a mayor based down in
the West Midlands. Yeah.
Yes.
And he and I and the other mayors have always worked together in a very practical way, and we did in that period of time.
And a Conservative mayor.
Conservative mayor.
And we go up to paragraph 71, please, on the last point in relation to this. We advised that there was concerns about the proposed tier system, to put in context, with restrictions and no identifiable support. Support was most likely to be available from a national circuit breaker.
That's what we were calling for.
Rather than the North standing alone.
That's what we were saying. There should be a national circuit break, leaving the north of England under restrictions and the rest of the country not.
Was that the view, without being overly emotive about it, but did you and your fellow Metro mayors feel that the North was standing alone?
Well, the thing was, if you go back to the start of the pandemic, it went up from the south, and it was national lockdown when it was there, and but when we had the high case rate and it was about to come back down the country, it was then regional and tiers, and did we feel like we were standing alone? Definitely, very much so. It just felt that we were treated in a way that other parts of the country wouldn't be treated. There is honestly no way that a borough in Greater London, or I would say in the wider South East, would be treated like Bolton were treated. No way at all.
I'm going to move on to another topic linked to this, which is the debate about Tier 3 restrictions, which occurred in October 2020, shortly after this meeting. And I'm going to summarise your evidence and then ask you a couple of questions, if I may. You described that there was unprecedented engagement between Greater Manchester and the government around this time, around the 7th of October, your wife's anniversary, your anniversary, and over the next few days. And the issue concerned, the sticking point concerned financial support, and you raised the concern that there needed to be sufficient financial support. And to summarise quite a complex issue, the sticking point related to the level of financial support. A national lockdown would have 80% of a person's salary, whereas is it right that what was offered in these discussions was less than that 80%?
So my memory of this meeting is very much that it was dominated by financial support, because this was about the tier system in principle, not what they hadn't told us they were about to do within a day or two. But we were really clear at this stage, you can't do this, you can't do a Bolton to everybody. You know, you've got to put in place proper financial support. And to be fair, I think Matt Hancock understood that, and he said he would take it back to the Treasury. I remember him saying that in that meeting. I said, look, I can't support measures without that support. And I said really clearly at that point, you can't tell people working in pubs, bingo halls, betting shops, that they only get 67% of their wages, because that's what was kind of building around at this time, that there would be a kind of a tier 3 package for people whose workplaces were closed.
And what would the answer be to someone saying, well, 67% of someone's wage is sufficient compared to 80%?
Well, these, by definition, are people on the lowest wages. So when everyone else was sitting in their gardens on 80%, why would they get 67%? What would possibly be the justification for that?
Yes.
Other than that they were in the north of England in low-paid jobs. Oh, well, you know, that's how it felt to us. And that's why this is the issue about the Tier 3 debate. It became a point of principle about this. They tried to portray that we were quibbling about 75 million or 65. It wasn't. We were saying you've got to put enough money in the system to give people on very low wages that at least an 80% furlough scheme.
I'm going to return to that in a moment. But
except we are coming to that in a later module, Mr. Keating.
Yes. Yes.
Have we had enough for this module?
Nearly. We're nearly there, my lady. I'm going to trespass on your patience just for a moment. In relation to this, and this is going to the points to assist my lady, and is in relation to whether a tier system was going to work. And actually, in relation to that, isn't it right that you had a meeting on the 14th of October with Jonathan Van Tam?
Yes.
And a junior Minister for Health. And there was expression, you asked whether the tier system, would it be effective? Would it address rising cases? And what was the response in relation to that?
So we were sceptical about the tier system because we've been under it since July and it hadn't worked. And we knew if they carried on with the 67% furlough that there would be definite damage to people's lives and people's businesses. So in meetings, and particularly with Jonathan Van Tam, myself and the 10 leaders of Greater Manchester said, give us, if we're going to do this, you have to guarantee to us that this is actually going to work and it's going to bring the cases down, the R number down below 1.
And the response?
That he couldn't give us that guarantee. Okay. And I think, if I could, this gets to the heart, really, of my evidence and what I wanted to say today.
I'm going to draw that together and give you that opportunity and draw this topic together. And it's right. There wasn't an agreement between you and central government. That's a matter of fact.
We heard the Deputy Chief Medical Officer say the Tier 3 approach wasn't going to necessarily bring our case rate down.
And you're aware that there has been criticism in central government and in wider media of the stance you took, that you were being obstructive and had behaved appallingly. I'm quoting a minute in a meeting. I want to give you the opportunity to be able to respond to that criticism, and then I'm going to move on to another topic.
I've seen that minute, the COVID-0 minute, and frankly, it's nothing short of a disgraceful, the points that were made in that minute. To say, quote back what you just said, the Mayor of Greater Manchester was behaving appallingly. It wasn't me that was behaving appallingly. It was the people in that room that were behaving appallingly, because they were about to impose a policy on Greater Manchester which they knew didn't work. And that's something that I've only now realised looking at other people's statements to this inquiry. And it makes me angry on behalf of the people of Greater Manchester that they sat in that room and they imposed a policy that they had been advised by Sage and others would not work. Indeed, I'm reading Matt Hancock's evidence to this inquiry. I could give you the number if you wish to call it up.
We're going to have the advantage of him giving evidence himself in a few days' time.
So let me just quote from his written evidence. I won't. This is critical for us because I think the people of Greater Manchester need to hear this and understand this. He says in his evidence about Tier 3, I was in despair that we had announced a policy that we knew would not work.
Did he explain or express that to you around the time of your discussions and negotiations?
No, he didn't.
No.
And I see this conversation in this COVID-0 committee where they then starting to talk about a punishment beating for Greater Manchester, that Lancashire should have a lighter set of measures imposed than Greater Manchester since they had shown willingness to cooperate. Tougher measures should be imposed on Greater Manchester that day because we stood up for people in our city region who would otherwise have really struggled had they gone into that lockdown without the funds to help them. Because we took that stand, they decided to make an example of us. And it's unbelievable for me now to look at evidence saying they knew it didn't work. They knew Tier 3 didn't work. They knew that, but they were still going to impose it on us without enough financial support.
Mr. Brennan, I'm going to invite you to pause there. I wanted to give you that opportunity. I think you've had a reasonable opportunity to deal with that matter, and I'm going to move on and hopefully have your assistance in relation to another topic. Is that okay? Mm-hmm. Communications. And another area I've been invited to explore with you is the wider communications from central government and how they were received on a local level from your perspective, and in relation to certain communities, minority ethnic communities. From your experience, was there issues with the central communication, central government communication, or blanket messaging as you described it?
Yes, I mean, we worked hard to make sure that the core messages from the government were put into languages that could be understood by everybody in Greater Manchester. I think, if I'm being fair, I think there was some collaboration on these matters between public health information experts in Greater Manchester and at the government level, but it was a constant challenge. The absence of British Sign Language interpreter at the daily briefings was unforgivable, to be honest, all the way through.
We've dealt with that in evidence already, but thank you. I'm going to move on really as a final section and firmly with lessons learned, how to do things better going forward. There may be a couple of topics you might want to raise, but one of them you've touched upon already, and I promised you I would return back to it, would be your view as to the placement of the metro mayors in a civil resilience structure.
Yeah.
I think I said I'd come back to that.
Yes.
That's something you wanted to deal with.
Yes, I just think it's what should be there in a situation like this. Here's my central argument. A more devolved approach to the pandemic would have been a safer approach to the pandemic. The way we run this country is often concentrating power in a very small number of hands in Downing Street and in the middle of Whitehall. It's dysfunctional in normal times. I would say it's dangerous to run things like that in a pandemic. You look at countries like Germany that adopted a much more devolved approach to these things.
Just pausing there, in terms of, you had the Hein Review when you were post the swine flu pandemic. Mm-hmm. Is there any view that you have regarding the principle of subsidiarity in relation to this?
But that was the central call from the Hein Review, which I set up. It said that a future pandemic should be handled in a much more delegated way, devolved way, with much greater subsidiarity. And it would appear that had not been taken on board. And the thing that I kind of will come back to is it just because the absence of those structures just meant that people, whenever I spoke to them in Downing Street or Whitehall, they just didn't seem to know how people were feeling in our part of the world. It had been miserable, really, all through 2020, with almost endless restrictions. But they just didn't seem to know. If I could just inform the committee on the kind of final day when we were about to have Tier 3 imposed on the 20th of October 2020, I had a final call with the then Prime Minister, Mr. Johnson. And he was saying, we just need you to agree to these tier 3 restrictions and the package of support. And I said, well, we can't, it's not enough. You know, we've been under restrictions for a long time. He said, what do you mean? I said, we've been under restrictions since July. You do know about that, don't you?
And what was the response?
And to me, it didn't seem that he did know about that. He wasn't aware that we'd been struggling all of that time. And I think it's the absence of a kind of place every week where people can report in to say, this is how it feels for us at this moment in time. That, I think, led to a situation where there just wasn't an understanding of what some of the things the government was doing, what they were actually, the impact they were having on people's lives. And that's why I hope this inquiry will make some clear recommendations about a more devolved infrastructure that can then both be represented at a national UK level, but then be given more responsibility to deal with the pandemic at a regional and local level.
Mr. Burnham, thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Questions. My lady, I think you've granted permission for questions from one of the core participants.
I have, Mr. Weatherby.
Thank you, my lady. Mr. Burnham, as I think you know, I represent the COVID bereaved Families for Justice UK group. And you've known of that group since it formed because you were in fact one of the first public figures to support the call for this public inquiry.
Yes.
I've got permission just for 2 short points picking up on the matters you've just been asked about. I'm just going to ask you about the period in the middle of September and then briefly the middle of October. On the 16th of September, you wrote a letter to Mr. Hancock, which I'll put up just to remind you of it. It's 165174. Now, I'm not going to read through that, but it's a letter from you to Mr. Hancock, Secretary of State for Health, setting out a whole raft of proposals for escalation measures to be implemented, quite sophisticated measures to be implemented in Greater Manchester in response to the rising cases across the 10 council areas, including support for self-isolation, local food support, services for vulnerable groups, vulnerable people, a call for some changes to local enforcement powers to target enforcement better, and localised enhancement of test, trace and isolate that you've already mentioned. Is that right?
Yes.
And then if we can just flick onto the next page.
I think this is what I was saying a moment ago. This is what a more devolved approach to the pandemic, in our view, would have looked like.
The reason I wanted it to put up is so that we can all see, the inquiry can see, the level of sophistication and thought that Greater Manchester had put into this. But the second series of bullet points on the second page is then refer to the other side of the coin, which is what you needed from government. And that included additional funding to help the self-isolation proposals. You needed some legislative changes to support targeted approach to enforcement and realistic levels of funding to enable local and time-limited interventions, as you've said. So again, sophisticated set of proposals from your side, and then a list of asks, and of course the perennial need for resources to support that. Is that right?
Yes.
So we can take that down, please, and just briefly put up 165173. So the next day, Mr. Hancock responds in a series of WhatsApp messages with you. And I think this rather evidences what you said earlier about him having a cordial, helpful engagement with you on this level. Is that right?
Yes.
And he's checking with you things which are essentially just needed to be checked over with the letter. And you're making clear at the bottom is that you'd be prepared to do localised curfews. You're concerned about the confusing patchwork of restrictions across the 10 council areas, and a clear sense that they're of limited and diminishing effectiveness. And so you're explaining to Mr. Hancock the purpose of your letter and what you need, and that seems to be going all fine in terms of your communication in detail and his orientation to you. Now, in terms of the financial support, am I right that this was particularly related to low-paid and vulnerable groups? Because without financial support, then there was no way of ensuring the effectiveness of these measures to reduce the high case level.
Yes, this was a theme that I said before we'd raised all the way through. Greater Manchester has a higher number of people who can't access sick pay, or who don't get paid if they're not
So people on 0 hours, people
Yes.
in the gig economy. You mentioned some self-employed people.
There was a survey by Unison Northwest early in the pandemic that found that 80% of domiciliary care workers in the Northwest said they wouldn't be able to self-isolate if they were asked to do so because they wouldn't be paid.
Yeah,
You know, that really brings home, if you can't fix that issue, you can't fix the pandemic.
And you're acutely aware of that as the mayor for the area.
Yeah.
Now, we've looked at the immediate response from Mr. Hancock by the WhatsApps, but did this letter of the 16th of September, did this actually lead to any greater financial resources being provided?
I think there were some modest moves later in 2020, but they were never, there was a scheme to be administered by local authorities, but it never got close to the simplicity of the scheme that myself and the mayor of the Liverpool City region were calling.
So these extra resources, to a large extent, you were not able to implement them because of the lack of resourcing.
They never were, we never.
Okay, second point, and briefly, fast forward a month, but same theme, 19th of October. I just want to put up a note prepared by the Cabinet Office, 104731. And again, I'm not going to go through it, but I just wanted to prompt your memory. So this is a note of a meeting with your council leaders and Mr. Jenrick, Minister of State. And this, I think, was aimed at reaching agreement on Tier 3 and from your side, certainly, a financial support package for Greater Manchester. I just want to look at the headline section that's been highlighted there. The summary, and that's Robert Jenrick himself, he summed up by stating that there seems to be a lot of common ground, though not on financial support measures. And then in the second bullet point, he reaffirmed that a hardship fund was not an option tabled by Her Majesty's government. Later, we don't need to go to it, but later in the document, Ed Lister raised, and it was agreed that time wasn't on anybody's side, given rapidly increasing infection rates. The reference to your request for a hardship fund was, again, going back to the things we've just discussed, assistance for the self-employed and those who simply couldn't afford to stay off work. So it obviously hadn't been resourced up to that point. Was there any further financial resourcing for these measures from there, or did the government stick to its guns in terms of saying, well, we like your ideas, but we're just not going to pay for it?
No, it stuck to its guns. I mean, what we were calling for was money to top up that 67% furlough, that top-up wages point. That's what that refers to. And the government at that point was saying, no, you can have 65 million, which was the core kind of funding that everyone had been offered. And in fact, although they claimed that they were negotiating with us, that was a formula, actually, that they were applying to everybody in Tier 3. So the next day, we go into the final because this was the 19th of October, the next day, the 20th. The final conversation I had with Robert Jenrick, that was the last person I spoke to before they said we're imposing. Well, he told me that, he said, you've been through the whole thing now, we're going to impose. And I said, well, we've tried to work with you. We don't think what we're saying is unreasonable. So I take it with you you're imposing what you put on the table, the 65 million. Oh no, there's no guarantee of that.
Yes.
And what happened was I went outside to tell the world that we were having this imposed on us, and we tried to avoid it, and we tried to get the best that we could, and we didn't agree with it. And it was in the middle of that when a Greater Manchester MP, Lucy Powell, sent a text to my political director saying, I'm in a meeting with Hancock. He's telling us about the details of the imposition, and he said that we are going to get 25 million. So not only did they not guarantee that, they tried to then initially say they were going to punish us with this
Less money.
Yeah, and this is how this whole thing was handled. It was like classic divide and rule.
Yeah.
And should ministers be doing that in the middle of a national emergency? No, they should not.
I had a third point, but you've already answered it. So thank you, Mr. Burnham.
Thank you.
Mr. Weatherby. Mr. Keating, that completes the question.
It is.
Mr. Burnham.
It is, my lady. Thank
Mr.
you.
Burnham, thank you very much indeed for your help.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Right, I think I'm being encouraged to take a break now. I shall return at 25 past.
Thank you, my lady.
Indeed, my lady. May I call Steve Rotherham, please, the Mayor of Liverpool City Region?
Sorry to have kept you waiting.
I do solemnly and sincerely
and truly declare
and affirm that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Thank you, Mr. Rotherham. Mr. Rotherham, if you can keep your voice up. We also have a stenographer who is taking a note and effectively preparing a transcript of what you are saying. So if we can take things slowly. If I ask you to slow down, it's my fault, not yours, just to ensure that an accurate note is taken. And again, if I ask you to repeat anything, that may well be why. Similarly, if I ask a question and you're not sure what I'm asking or you need clarification, just say. Okay. So, Mr. Rotherham, thank you again for assisting the inquiry. You've also provided a witness statement. That statement is dated the 17th of August of this year. It runs to some 15 pages. And indeed, at the very outset, what we see is a statement and declaration of truth. And if we turn to page 15, we'd ordinarily see your signature, but of course it's been redacted. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Thank you. Mr. Rotherham, your evidence today is concerned with your role as Mayor of the London City Region. Is that correct?
Liverpool City Region, yes.
Indeed. So did I say London? I'm sorry, Liverpool City Region. I've got Mr. Cahn's evidence in my mind.
Well, you may not be forgiven for that.
I know. I'm off to a bad start already. Let's hope it can only get better from here. But just dealing then perhaps with your professional background, you were heavily involved in local politics initially as a councillor. From there, you became the Lord Mayor of Liverpool from 2008 to 2009. You then were elected as the Member of Parliament for Liverpool Bolton and occupied that role from 2010 to 2017. And then in 2017, you were the elected Metro Mayor of the Liverpool City Region. And indeed, you were re-elected in 2021.
Correct.
Thank you. So it's fair to say that you've had perhaps a long-standing commitment, but moreover, knowledge of Liverpool and its surrounds. Now, I want to turn now, if I may, to the structure of the Liverpool City Region Combined Authority. That's a consequence of a devolution agreement that was signed with the government back in 2017. And it's composed of 6 local authorities. Just to run through them very quickly: Bolton, Knowsley, Liverpool, Sefton, St Helens and the Wirral. Is that right?
That's correct.
Thank you. Now, if I can just take you to paragraph 3 of your witness statement, as is on the screen here. That sets out the powers, effectively, that are conferred upon the Liverpool City, I'm afraid, Regional Authority, and indeed the Mayor. And those are economic development, transport, housing, planning and employment and skills. We've heard a little bit about this already earlier today, but there's one notable exception, isn't there, in relation to the pandemic, and that's health. Is that right?
Indeed.
Indeed. Now, similarly, it's not a Category 1 or Category 2 responder under the Civil Contingencies Act and framework. But separately to that, you are an active member of the Merseyside Resilience Forum. Can you just tell us a little bit about that, please?
Well, we have statutory responsibility for public transport, and obviously that's an important role in regard to the Merseyside Resilience Forum, and therefore we have a seat on that. But as the Metro Mayor of the area, we don't have any codified or statutory responsibilities, believe it or not, because the Civil Contingencies Act is 2004, and that predates the Metro Mayors, which came in 2017.
And we're going to turn to that in due course in relation to the structural relationships and potential deficits as you see them. But just dealing with that resilience forum that oversees effectively the preparedness, response and recovery from a major instance within that region. Is that right?
That's correct.
Thank you. And similarly, as a consequence of that, it also has responsibility in relation to financials and financial distribution of money effectively in response to restrictions imposed upon the region. And that was true within the pandemic.
Yeah, both in regard to settlements with the government, but also to passport funding as a conduit to local authorities.
Thank you. If I can now turn, please, to your role as Mayor, so your individual role, how would you describe that?
Well, I've seen mayors today give evidence, and it's very similar to what you've already heard. I believe that you need a single voice, and there was never a more opportune time for devolution to work than through a pandemic, where you had a single point of contact and somebody who could liaise both with national government and through regional structures with local government.
Indeed. Indeed, as you set out within your statement, also effectively working in the interests of the Liverpool City region area.
Always with that at heart.
At the heart of what you do.
Indeed.
With regard to your responsibilities as Mayor during the Covid-19 pandemic, there was not a codified set of responsibilities in respect to your mayoral role, was there?
That's correct.
And I think certainly within your statement you set out that there were three broad categories within which your responsibilities fell. The first of that was civic leadership and coordination. And how did you see that role?
Well, that was speaking up for our area, but also working with other political partners of all different political persuasions to ensure that those voices were heard at central government. Central government may well be from a different political party than me, but the real important issue was that we both did the right things for the 1.6 million people in the Liverpool City region. And so I was very vocal at times to ensure that our voices were heard over the clamour you can imagine from other areas in the country.
Indeed. And you've referred to the 1.6 million, that's residents, isn't it, within the Liverpool City region? Mm-hmm. And that rises to approximately 3 million people, including people working within the region. Is that right?
The functional economic geography is a little bit more than that. We think about 3.2 million.
About 3.2 million. Thank you. The second of those roles and responsibilities is facilitating funding. We've touched on that briefly in terms of the broader structure. But just dealing with that deals with the city region and for the benefit of local residents and businesses.
It does.
So it has two sides to it. In that respect, those who live there, but also the business and economic activity within the area and the region.
Yeah, there's money from central government, but also, of course, we have different sources of our own funding, and all of that is to ensure that we get the flexibilities to spend the money the way we believe it should be spent in our city region.
Effectively targeting where you feel it's needed most.
Yes, but some we get passported money. In other words, it's hypothecated to the city region, and is ring-fenced for certain issues that we have no flexibilities within.
Of course. And then finally, you describe your third set of responsibilities as sustaining services. And if you can just tell us a little bit about that very briefly.
Public transport's probably the main one, and even throughout the pandemic, of course, public transport never stopped. And so that's why it was important that we had that voice in the Merseyside Resilience Forum, but without having the statutory responsibility to be there, we were all too often reliant on the people who represented the combined authority on that forum to come back and to inform us of things that were happening, plus the goodwill of people like the Police and Crime Commissioner and the Chief Constable at the time, which was Andy Cook.
Thank you. I will be putting public transport to one side. It's fair to say that various accommodations were made by you in your role throughout the pandemic, including free transport for key workers, those sorts of accommodations, and then also, of course, you're trying to deal with the deficit from individuals not utilising public transport during that time and the revenues that would incur. Is that right?
One of the benefits of devolution is that we can take those decisions locally, and we decided that there were charges against key workers and essential workers, and we wanted to ease that burden during the height of the pandemic because they were the only people who were using public transport, and yet we were charging them to use that public transport, so we tried to reduce the burden.
And then if I may just turn to an area, another area in which there was no authority, and that relates to the regulations and the COVID legislation. And you played no role within those, developing those.
No role nationally, but not even consulted locally.
And I'm going to move to consultation in just one moment in relation to both the Liverpool City region and Westminster. And certainly in relation to that, if I can just take you back to the initial stages then of the pandemic, was there any engagement from central government through the months of January, February and up to the lockdown?
No, and people might remember that actually the people who came to isolate and to go to Arrow Park Hospital from who'd been to Wuhan, they came through many areas and ended up in the Liverpool City region, and we weren't even informed that these people were going to travel through our area or end up in a hospital environment being isolated.
So just before I turn to that that's effectively in early February of 2020, were you aware in January or prior to that of the issues in terms of the pandemic and COVID-19 with respect to the UK in terms of communications from central government?
I believe that was the 31st of January when the quarantine happened, and obviously we were all aware, weren't we, as citizens of the world, that something significant was happening. But at that stage, some people believe that it could be contained and not end up as a pandemic.
And so when individuals were repatriated from Wuhan and sent to Arrow Park on the Wirral, when did you first find out about that?
On the news.
Nice. What did you do in response to that? Did you try to make any communication with Westminster?
Well, first of all, we contacted Wirral Council because they were the local authority in which Arrow Park Hospital is located, and they had no notifications in advance, and that seemed to be the way in which things were conducted early on.
And did that continue as we moved through the March period into lockdown? Again, were you consulted at any point, or was information or communication made with you or your team?
No, there was nothing in particular. Obviously, there was back channels and informal conversations about what potentially might happen. But within the combined authority, we would sit around at 5 to 6 waiting for the evening news to see whether there was going to be an announcement at 6 o'clock that we would be locked down, and that happened for week after week. And of course, we all know when the announcement happened, but right up until the day of the announcement by the Prime Minister, there was no conversations at all locally.
So as we were approaching the lockdown and from February onwards, did you begin to make your own preparations?
Well, we did in as much as that we started to think about what the group of people that we'd need to pull together would look like. And I think in March was our first COVID action group, and that was, you know, MPs, the local police, and all the relevant agencies all coming together so that we had a forum that we could all share information in outside, of course, the statutory responsibility of the Civil Contingencies Act.
And was that prior to lockdown or post-lockdown?
It was our first meeting was on the 20th, which is the Friday before lockdown. So the planning of that must have been weeks before.
Indeed. In your statement, you describe also engaging with the local NHS, Directors of Public Health, from February effectively onwards. Is that right?
Yeah, and one of the problems that we had is that, again, that was predicated on the goodwill of people who were leading local authority areas for me to have access to their Directors of Public Health and not a statutory responsibility.
Again, going back to that potential lacuna that you identified at the outset.
Absolutely.
Now, as the pandemic progressed and post-lockdown, did things improve to any degree in terms of communications with government?
When are we talking about here? What month?
Effectively post-lockdown,
After the
from that
23rd.
March, April, May period.
Yes, there was some informal communications, but there were no official channels for us to raise any particular issues. And it was much later on that we started to get the access to the Secretaries of State and senior ministers in the government that we needed to, so that we could find out the information necessary to put appropriate measures into what was happening locally.
Indeed, we've heard a little bit earlier this afternoon about attempts to engage with Westminster and to attend Cobra. Were you part of those attempts?
Yeah, we believed as a group, it was called the M9 at the time, and there were 9 Metro mayors, and I think it was 4 Tories, 5 Labour, so it was, you know, it was pretty balanced, and we believed that there should be representation from that group at Cobra. We hadn't decided who that might be, but we did believe that our voices should be heard because of the enormity of the population that those 9 people had represented.
And with regard to that M9 group, the group of Metro mayors, did there ever come a point where you were represented essentially by one individual in that way?
No, I don't believe so.
And indeed, you did not attend Cobra, save for one exception, which we'll move to later in the chronology, in October of 2020.
Yes, that's correct.
We've heard evidence earlier that you and Andy Burnham issued joint statements asking government to widen membership to also include mayors from the North West. Did you ever get a response to that?
No, I don't believe we did.
Turning, as we go again through the chronology and into the summer, and looking at engagement, a number of MPIs were as relaxed as coming out of lockdown initially, but then also Eat Out to Help Out was announced. Did you have any advance notice of either those relaxations or the scheme?
We had no notification whatsoever, so that came as a real bolt out the blue.
And so were you finding out as the public found out?
Yeah, on nearly every major announcement, we were watching the telly, and we work late anyway in our office, so we were staying till stupid hour watching what was happening on the news so that we could then start to formulate our response to that for the next day.
And did that present any challenges for you?
Consistently.
And what challenges were they?
Well, that we were reacting rather than proactively working in engagement with central governments to formulate some of those policies.
Did that cause any difficulties with your constituency base?
often, especially on messaging, and we desperately needed a single voice and some coherence around that message, and that was often lost because things were quite fluid and changed quite often, and things would flip-flop one way and then a different way at a different occasion. So it was much more difficult to take people with you.
Indeed. We're going to deal with some of those challenges later when it comes to looking at tiers. But were there also any logistical challenges for the authority?
There was. I'll give you an example. Both the Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, and myself were asking, I think in April, around face coverings. And I wanted the government to introduce this, and I wanted to do it locally. And believe it or not, I would have had to have changed the bylaws locally and get that through the legislative process to do that before we could enforce face coverings. So there were lots of things that happened where if it had to come from central government, that would have alleviated the local problems that we were facing.
We've heard a little bit already this morning about that issue and engagement on that issue. So I'm going to leave that there, but mainly because we've got other points to cover this afternoon. But dealing then, if I may, that's public communications and messaging. I'm going to now come to the tiers, and that takes us somewhat ahead, following ETO to help out the summer time, and then effectively moving through September and into October. Now, in October, is it correct that there were rising infection rates in the northwest, and in particular within the Liverpool region?
There were across the northwest, but specifically in the Liverpool City region, and one of our areas was the third highest R rate in Europe.
So you had one of the third highest R rates in Europe. In terms of the situation with regard to the NHS and hospitals, how did that present itself in the Liverpool City region?
Well, by now we were having regular conversations and meetings with the directors of public health, with our NHS representatives and with the scientists. And around mid-October, we were getting genuinely concerned that the NHS didn't have the capacity. If the R rate had continued and the numbers of people were presenting with infections in hospital, then there would have been no capacity at all within the Merseyside area for anybody presenting with any other condition that was non-COVID. So we were literally at capacity and worried that it might tip over.
The inquiry has heard some evidence about the development of the tier structure in response to concerns such as the rising R rate and infection numbers within Liverpool. When did you find out about the potential for tiering?
So we'd had some conversations with the Secretary of State, Matt Hancock, early in October, I think it was the 5th. And within that, he'd said there might be the need for some additional restrictions. And I think tiering might have been muted, certainly no detail on that. And what we were very concerned with at that same time was that the government had also floated the idea that furlough would be reduced from 80% to 67%. And so that was the main topic of conversation from my perspective, because I was 100% opposed to any reduction, because that would have hit our area harder than anywhere in the country.
Indeed, and presumably you've been listening to the evidence immediately before you from Andy Burnham in relation to furlough. I'm not going to go back over that now, save us to say you're on the same page as him, presumably.
I didn't hear it all, and the connectivity is not brilliant, so it cut out. But generally, we do speak with one voice, myself and the Mayor of Greater Manchester, because we were communicating on a regular basis, a daily basis, during that terrible period.
In terms of Tier 1, Tier 2 and Tier 3 and potential Tier 3 restrictions for the Liverpool City region, when did you first hear about that?
So we had a meeting with the Chief Medical Officer on the 9th of October. I think that was the Friday. And within that, he outlined the concerning situation across the Liverpool City region with the R8, but with the NHS. And it was understood that something needed to happen specifically in our geography, because we were genuinely concerned that we wouldn't have any additional capacity. So that was the first time that that sort of thing had been discussed. He showed us all of the scientific evidence, put charts up on the screen. It was along with all of the leaders in the Liverpool City region, so the 6 local authority council leaders. So we basically knew we had to do something collectively.
And in terms of doing something collectively, at that point, was it envisaged that it would be a tiered system with increasing levels of restrictions, or were you looking at something different?
I think that came on the Saturday, the actual, we need to discuss about this new thing, Tier 3. We started to talk about what that might look like and what those additional restrictions would be, whether it be an a la carte menu or whether it be a prescriptive list of things that we had to do. And of course, then if we did enter into Tier 3, because at that stage nobody had, if we were first entrants, what any financial support package would look like, because obviously that would mean with another local lockdown that businesses would be constrained. And we were very, very adamant that businesses shouldn't be detrimentally impacted.
So were financial considerations a concern for you at that point?
Massive.
Yeah. Now, in terms of discussion with the government, from the 9th to the 11th of October, spans a weekend in short.
Yeah.
You were involved in a number of discussions, negotiations, is that right, in relation to the measures that would be taken within the region, but also the financial package that would come alongside it?
Yeah, with all sorts of people within Number 10 and secretaries of state and scientists and Uncle Tom Cobley and all, to tell you the truth. But we really wanted to understand the science and whether the list that eventually emerged would do the job, whether that would tackle some of the problems that we'd previously identified.
And just to be clear, those discussions and negotiations involved the Prime Minister, 18. What we have here is the government's chief scientific advisor, so Professor Sir Patrick Vallance, explaining that the impact of lockdowns and the impact of doing nothing were known, the impact of interventions between them was not known. And it continues, however, while the granularity of effects were not yet known, it was clear a baseline Tier 3 approach would not reduce
had called for some considerable time in the build-up to all of this, because we understood that whilst we had to do stuff to control things within our own geography, there's a bleed between geographies. People don't stick rigidly to those administrative boundaries. So within the curtilage of the Liverpool City region, every single day people flow in and out of it. And we knew that it was much more difficult to do it in one area, but we had to try something. And by the way, what we did was demonstrably successful, because despite, that's a generalised statement, isn't it? But within the Liverpool City region, we did see a fall over those 3 weeks, even with a Tier 3 approach.
Of course, it was then Tier 3 then moved into the national lockdown.
Exactly at the point, yeah.
At
But
the
we'd
end.
already started to go in the right
But
direction.
infections had started to decrease.
Yes.
Now, at that point, was your view that Liverpool City region ought to enter into a tier system, or that there ought to be a circuit breaker?
I think it was an inevitability that we were going to go into Tier 3, given the Times headline. What I was most concerned about was the messaging. And I pointed out earlier, if you don't take the public with you, it doesn't matter what those restrictions might have looked like and the arguments for or against it. It had to be communicated correctly to the people in the Liverpool City region, and I wasn't afforded that opportunity.
And just going to that and not being afforded that opportunity, after this Cobra, agreement was reached and finalised. And at that point, is it right that you had a phone call with the Prime Minister?
Yeah.
And what was discussed in that phone call with the Prime Minister?
Well, exactly the whole scenario about how we would communicate to ensure that there was compliance as widely as possible. And I very much emphasised the fact that a Tory Prime Minister in an area like the Liverpool City region might not be the best person to be communicating this. And so therefore there should be a joint comms strategy on this. And we needed to get the messaging absolutely nailed down. And he agreed to that. So I had my team ready and was expecting a phone call from number 10's team so that we could agree some wording on what that would look like. But unfortunately, that wasn't the case.
Indeed. Later that afternoon, it was announced by the Prime Minister that Liverpool City region was entering Tier 3. Is that right? And then subsequently in a number 10 press conference that evening.
On both of those occasions, yeah, without any notification to me, and then we had to try and pick up the pieces.
And what were the consequences of that in terms of implementing Tier 3 within the Liverpool City region?
At this stage, we were the first, as I say, but Manchester, because of their extended restrictions period, were still trying to get a deal. So it looked as if we were doing a deal, but we hadn't had those same restrictions prior to Tier 3. And people didn't understand that outside. It was a confusion of who was saying what, and why would Manchester not accept the deal and we would accept the deal. And as I've explained, for all the right reasons, we wanted to ensure that we could reduce the R rate, but also about the deaths, because as the R rate increased, the death rate did. And we were really cognizant of the fact that far too many people had already succumbed, and we needed to do everything that we possibly could. And what happened was, as soon as the Prime Minister stood up in the House of Commons, Twitter literally blew up. My team, who, tried to manage the social media side of things, just said there's thousands, and that resulted in all sorts of threats and unintended consequences, I'm sure.
And when you say threats, do you mean threats to you or to your team?
I think probably to me more than the team, but there were direct threats, and that resulted in the chief constable having to post 24-hour security. And I'm not sure that when the Prime Minister broke that agreement with me that in any way he thought that might have been a consequence. But that's why I was so clear in what we needed to do to prevent those sorts of eventualities.
Now, with regard to public compliance, the Liverpool City region did go into Tier 3 the following day.
Yeah.
On the 13th of October. It remained in Tier 3 up until the national lockdown, the second lockdown, came into force. But initially, it was to last for 4 weeks with a sunset clause. Is that right?
It was, and we got a financial package to support that. But the issue wasn't the 4 weeks. The issue was the additional restrictions, because we agreed the package, and I was told that it was a prescriptive package. And then Lancashire went into Tier 3, and their restrictions were different than ours, and that caused, again, a hiatus and some problems.
Indeed, and within your witness statement, you set out the correspondence that you subsequently have in relation to that package, financial arrangements and so on, mostly outside of the scope of this particular module, but of course the information is there, so I don't propose to take you further through that with regard to that aspect. Just want to touch now, if I may, on one other issue, and that is firstly, in terms of the lobbying, you lobbied the government on various issues, one being access to PPE. You've already mentioned face coverings. A third being financial support that you've touched upon already, and indeed we've heard evidence earlier today, and there will be some questions on that in due course. So I'm not going to deal with that in any great detail now, but simply in relation to potential financial support packages to enable individuals to self-isolate. That was your concern in relation to the test and trace programme, is that right?
This was fundamental, really, to why I believe that the R rate had spiked, because there were far too many people, certainly low-paid jobs in the Liverpool City region, where them people were faced with a sword of Damocles decision, and that was, if they felt that they might have had symptoms, they were choosing whether to stay home and get no pounds, no pence, or to take the chance that they didn't have COVID and go to work. And I think that was an intolerable position to put anybody in. And we explained this time and time again to government that they needed to support us, because we needed to have a package to support those workers, so that if they felt that there may have been COVID symptoms, that they erred on the side of caution and stayed at home.
Indeed. And you launched a Time Out to Help Out campaign, a play on the Eat Out to Help Out campaign in terms of words. Again, you'll be asked some questions about that. The other aspect that I wish to touch on very briefly is one particular event that took place at the outset of the pandemic on the 11th of March. Yeah. Again, you're going to be asked some questions about that, but it's the Liverpool match, the Champions League match versus Atletico Madrid that took place. The background to that being that public health concerns were growing, as you've explained. And with regard to that time, what you say about that is that it was not clear at this stage if the government was seeking to take a herd immunity approach or was simply waiting until the last minute to implement a national lockdown. And that's in relation to the timing of this particular football match that was being played. Why did you consider herd immunity to be a real possibility at that stage?
Because the government didn't seem to have any strategy to tackling the pandemic, and it appeared that they were just allowing things to happen. Herd immunity, look, I'm not a scientist. I hadn't heard of herd immunity beforehand. This was something that we were reading about and learning about, and I'm worried about. But we do know, don't we, from evidence to this inquiry, that there are allegations against the Prime Minister about piling up the bodies, and that's how it felt out on the front line of this, if you like. You know, it felt as if they were just going to allow it to let rip, and that was a major concern for all of us.
Thank you. I'm going to leave the questions about involvement in decision-making in relation to that match to others. But if I may just ask you finally now, in terms of lessons to be learned for the future and recommendations, a few questions in relation to the structural aspects concerning the role that you played as mayor and the devolution agreements and the role of regional authorities essentially within any civil emergencies response. You've already explained that the Liverpool City Region Combined Authority is not a Category 1 responder under the Civil Contingencies Act. We've also heard that London is. To what extent do you consider that lack of status as a Category 1 responder made a difference to your ability to coordinate the regional response in the Liverpool City area?
Massive difference. As I say, I relied on the goodwill of others, including the leaders of local authorities. We were all from the same political persuasion. It might have been more difficult if we had people from different political parties, and therefore the likelihood that people could have played politics. At no stage did any individual leader of the local authorities or the combined authority ever put politics before people. It was always about our place and our people. And we were about protecting lives, but protecting livelihoods as well. And that was the mantra right the way through it. Because we weren't privy to some of the discussions and deliberations at the Merseyside Resilience Forum, it was people anecdotally telling us things that had happened there, and that cannot possibly be the best way that we can run things, and there needs to be a statutory footing for Metro mayors. Basically, our role needs to, the legislation needs to catch up with the advent of what we've now got across the city, across the country with regional mayors.
Of course, that legislation dates back to 2004, devolution agreements subsequent to that, considerably so. And do you consider that that lack of status played any role in the way you were treated by central government with regard to effectively Cobra meetings, Westminster and Number 10 Cabinet?
Possibly. I haven't got the evidence to support this, but there was a feeling that because we didn't need to be included, that at times we weren't. And I'm slightly more confident that if we did have that codified statutory responsibility within the Merseyside Resilience Forum, that not only would the information have been readily to hand, but also government would have had to have included Metro mayors and myself as part of the deliberations around that.
Thank you. I've got no further questions for you at this stage, but if you just pause there, my lady, there are two sets.
Mr Weatherby.
Thank you very much. Mr Rotherham, I ask questions on behalf of the COVID bereaved Families for Justice UK group. And just two short topics, the first of which is the Atletico Madrid match. And it's of particular importance because a number of the families that I represent believe that their loved ones contracted COVID as a result of that match going ahead. Now, for context, the match took place on the 11th of March, and that was the day that the Director General of the WHO, belatedly some may say, declared COVID to be a pandemic, and in doing so called internationally for urgent and aggressive action to combat its spread. His words, not mine. Yet on that date, the match was allowed to go ahead in Liverpool. And the match was attended by, as you know, more than 50,000 people. The attendance included something like 3,000 people from Madrid, And again, by way of context, at that time, Spain generally already had well-known high case numbers. Madrid was a particular hotspot, and many Spanish football games were already taking place behind closed doors, and there was a partial lockdown there at that time. So in terms of the match going ahead, were you consulted by ministers or government officials in relation to any decision to allow the match to go ahead?
So this was during March and sort of the pre-lockdown period, although of course it happened very quickly afterwards. There was this in the Cheltenham Festival, I think, at the same time.
Yeah.
And that's when lockdown happened, which was too late for some people. At no stage were we consulted by any body, not just national government, but there was no consultations with ourselves. Quite the opposite, actually. I mean, we were trying to get information, and at that stage, the government said the fixture was low risk.
Right. So, I mean, at that time, you were concerned about it. And was it your view that the match shouldn't go ahead?
Well, I was personally concerned as well because I'm a Liverpool fan,
Yes.
and I actually went to the game, and I remember it being very different than I think nearly every other game that I've been to because of fan behaviour. You were already seeing people sort of not socially distancing because you can't at a football match, but being much more cautious, and certainly with goals being scored, which we all know are a moment of unbridled joy. There was certainly a subdued way in which supporters were celebrating.
But, I mean, the concerns you had, did you think it should have gone ahead at the time or not? Or were you simply looking for guidance from official scientists or government ministers about it?
Well, we had no scientific evidence to support the fact that we were concerned about it. But if the government had said, listen, this is not going ahead, I think everyone would have breathed a sigh of relief. But there was no evidence presented to us that it was anything other than the low risk that the government claimed.
Did you attempt to contact ministers or officials to question that, to say where is the advice?
We had literally no conversations with national government at that stage about concerns over COVID. I mean, the doors were closed.
But did you attempt to do so?
No, not directly, no.
Yeah, okay. Now, following the match, later in April, I think it's a matter of public record that the city mayor, then Joe Anderson, called for an inquiry into why the game had been allowed to go ahead. And I think you supported that call for an inquiry, is that right?
I think if you get the chronology right, I was the first one.
You were
3
first.
days before to say that there needed to be an inquiry into it. What happened was that the Mayor of Liverpool had asked that Matt Ashton, who is the Director of Public Health, look at a local
I see. So you asked for a governmental level inquiry into whether the match should have gone ahead?
Yeah, I had concerns, and I had phone calls from people who were genuinely worried that parents had gone to it, and of course, 1 or 2 of those subsequently did succumb to the illness.
Yeah. And did you get any response from government level regarding the rationale for the decision to allow the match to go ahead, or how municipal authorities or anybody else was supposed to manage 3,000 attendees from Madrid? Did you get anything after the match was over, after your call for an inquiry, by way of explanation as to that?
This was, as I say, during the period where the government just blanked anything. I mean, it was a waste of time and energy trying to get them to do or help or assist or advise, because it all fell on deaf ears at this stage, and not just in March, but right the way through until May and beyond.
You called for an inquiry but got nothing back. Now, the second point is very, very quickly, different topic, but about the position later in the summer. Mr. Hancock, in his second statement at paragraph 454, effectively puts the blame on local leaders or some local leaders making political points rather than following the data in terms of the problems that you've already been asked about over the summer. How do you react to that? Was it local leaders who should be held accountable for the difficulties in the imposition of these localised regional restrictions, or were there other issues?
There was never an occasion where I was present at any meeting with any political parties or leaders where people tried to play party politics on this. But look, does politics play a part in the background to this? Of course it does. You know, when you have local authorities that are being hit the hardest in the whole country, they have a feeling that national government aren't listening to them. Yeah. When you have an NHS that's teetering anyway, they are political decisions, but there wasn't party politics that were in any way a consideration of the approach that we took.
Yeah, and
it was just a backdrop to everything.
As you said, that nearly half of the mayors, the metropolitan mayors, were in fact Conservatives.
Indeed, and within their combined authority areas, there are a mix of different political persuasions.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Weatherby. Ms. Peacock.
I have a few short questions on behalf of the Trades Union Congress. You've already touched upon in your evidence the Time Out to Help Out campaign you launched in August 2020 alongside Mr. Burnham. My questions focus on that campaign. That campaign asked central government to continue to pay workers their full wage when they were required to self-isolate and they were unable to work from home. Is that right?
Correct.
How did that campaign envisage, practically speaking, that workers would be paid to self-isolate? What was the proposal?
The proposal was that if anybody felt that they had the symptoms of coronavirus, to err on the side of caution and for them to stay at home, the employer would pay the statutory sick pay to them, the bit between statutory sick pay and what their wage was, but that'd be topped up by the government. So the employer would pay it, but they'd be recompensed by national government.
And in terms of self-employed people, was it envisaged that they could claim for loss of earnings up to a maximum daily amount as they're able to when on jury service? Is that right?
But that's what we thought. We thought, you know, people who have complied with their public duty to do jury service, for instance, that's what we were claiming that people should do with coronavirus. It was about public duty, and it was about those people thinking about what the consequences might have been if they went into work with symptoms and them symptoms had been realised.
And you explained in your evidence earlier that you considered this issue was absolutely fundamental to why the R rate spiked, because people on low incomes were being asked to make that very difficult decision between self-isolating and going to work and receiving payment. How did this issue come to your attention? How did you become aware that this was an important issue for workers and residents in the Liverpool city region?
Well, I think there was an excellent campaign by the unions to highlight the issue, but I was in dialogue with Frances O'Grady at the time, and she'd spoken out that something needed to happen because too many people, both the excluded group, so the people who were self-employed and freelancers, were being left behind, but so were people who didn't qualify because they were on 0 hours contracts, so they were under the threshold.
My final question is, do you consider that central government responded adequately to the Time Out to Help Out campaign and the need for financial support for self-isolation at any point during the pandemic?
I think this, like a number of other issues that we've discussed, was something that not only did they not respond adequately, I don't think they actually responded.
Those are my questions, my lady.
Thank you very much, Ms Peacock.
Thank you, my lady. That concludes the evidence for today.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr Rotherham. Safe journey back to Liverpool. Thank you for your help.
Thank you.
And that completes the evidence for today. 10 o'clock tomorrow? 10 o'clock tomorrow, please.
All rise.